On October 7th, 1988, 3 weeks before the release of Super Mario Bros. 3 in Japan, the Nintendo fan magazine Famicom Hishoban published a rather breathless article, commenting on an interview that Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi had given with the men's magazine Touch at the end of August. Yamauchi wasn't a particularly talkative man, especially not in front of the press, so it would have been clear to Famicom Hishoban's Japanese audience, even before they started reading, that he must have had something major to discuss, which indeed he did. An upcoming console, the Super Famicom, which would make use of a 16-bit Western Design Center processor to offer the public gaming experiences the likes of which had never been seen before. During the interview, Yamauchi shared his concern that the experience of playing games on the original Famicom might be getting a bit stale. In both Japan and the US, it had been phenomenally popular for the past several years, but that very success meant that the market was now likely saturated, and the 5-year-old console past its prime. He had good reason to worry. As momentous as the switch to tracker chip cartridges had been, enabling the release of games like The Legend of Zelda and Metroid on original NES hardware, in terms of both graphics and sound, home console games still lagged well behind what was possible on purpose-built arcade cabinets, focused on playing just one game. Not only that, but there was competition on the horizon from other hardware manufacturers aiming to close the gap themselves, and earn a substantial profit in doing so. The editors of Famicom Hishoban speculated that Yamauchi was speaking up now in order to keep Nintendo's customers from migrating to the PC Engine, a 16-bit home console developed by Hudson Soft, the Bomberman people, which had been released almost exactly a year earlier in Japan to a warm public reception, and which would ultimately launch in the US in mid-1989 with the extreme moniker TurboGrafx 16. But at least for now, Nintendo could fall back on the newly revitalized American market, which it had basically built up single-handed from the ashes of the 1983 crash, right? Wrong, actually. In the US, Nintendo had an even bigger problem on its hands, in the form of a third console manufacturer, Sega, which had eclipsed Nintendo in the arcades years earlier, and was now hustling to take a chunk of its home console sales too, with its provocatively named Master System, first released in the United States in 1986. Although it faced an uphill climb in trying to compete with a well-organized incumbent, Sega also had one advantage in this fight that Nintendo consistently failed to defend itself against. They were more in touch with the attitude of the American gamer in the late 80s and early 90s. Maybe because Sega itself was founded and run for many years by American businessmen, so the US had never been a market that they were entirely absent from. When you booted up your NES and played the games that Nintendo developed for it, more often than not, the hero of your game would be some silly-looking cartoon person, like a pudgy Italian guy who jumped on turtles and bumped his head on bricks hoping to find a magic mushroom inside, or an elf in little green shorts who played the flute and whose primary form of transportation was a raft. Sega games were the opposite of this, especially in the arcade, where they stood side by side with big shots like Capcom and Konami. In Sega games, you were always driving cars and shooting aliens with a laser gun, or flying in a jet with guns in it, not to mention heat-seeking missiles. Space Harrier, Outrun, Shinobi, Afterburner. These are all games from the late 80s that share two other things in common. They were considered among the best games in their class, and they were developed by Sega. And in the long term, this was a very bad thing for Nintendo, because the new 16-bit console generation promised to do for these games what Nintendo did with Donkey Kong back in the mid-80s. Slap it on a cartridge and sell millions of them to people tired of shelling out quarters at the local arcade. There were also new global markets to be considered, regions that had once been dominated by computer gaming, but were now eager to catch up to their home console-obsessed neighbors. Nintendo may have dominated Hudson and Sega in Japan, and held on to a majority of the market in the US, but despite a rocky beginning, Sega's Master System outsold the NES in Europe right up to the start of the 16-bit era, and managed to clean up in Brazil, where it was just as dominant as the NES was in the markets that it had entered first. All things considered, Nintendo was still definitely on top, but that position was more precarious now. It was less like being a pharaoh on top of his mighty throne, and more like being Humpty Dumpty on top of a very narrow wall, wondering if this is the day someone finally manages to climb up to the same height and push you off. That's why Nintendo needed the 16-bit power of the Super Famicom, both to develop arcade-style games of its own, and, in case that didn't work out, to innovate in non-arcadey ways, and hold on to its unique niche in the gaming world, even after it stopped being the only game in town. And to drive sales of this new console, they needed something else, a project that Yamauchi himself had mentioned in that August 1988 interview. They needed a game that would combine simple fun with the wow factor of cutting-edge graphics and sound. A game that would represent the state of the art in 1990 and remind everybody of why they played Nintendo to begin with. They needed Super Mario Bros. 4, or as it would eventually come to be known, Super Mario World. Considering how much the move to 16-bit hardware was hailed as a revolution in video gaming, Nintendo's customers might have been surprised to hear that the first step in the development of Super Mario Bros. 4 would be nothing more than taking the previous game in the series, porting it over to the Super Famicom hardware, and just tinkering with it. But this is exactly what the team did to start with. They wanted to see if playing an existing Mario game with 16-bit processing power, and maybe a few new gameplay gimmicks sprinkled in, would feel like a brand new experience just from the sheer novelty of higher quality graphics and sound. And after a few weeks of testing, they had their answer. Nope, it didn't. What it felt like was playing the same old game with a new coat of paint, which is fine as far as it goes, but hardly the type of thing that would make somebody part with $200 for a new console. So while the mechanics, the minute-to-minute gameplay of Super Mario World, would take advantage of all the refinements that 5 years of evolution had provided, when it came to the structure of this new game, how the stages and the various goals associated with them would be presented to the player, the team decided to make radical changes and essentially start from scratch. In the first two Super Mario games, stages had been presented in a linear order, one after the other. There were always warps, of course, for players clever enough to find them, but these didn't change anything about the order of stages. They just removed part of the sequence. It was sort of like the board game Monopoly, in which players always move in the same direction along a square of tiles. In that game, you can suddenly be moved to distant corners of the board as well, but after that's done, you continue moving as you had before, with no opportunities to travel backwards or skip over spaces during a normal turn. Super Mario Bros. 3 maintained the linear order of worlds, but within those worlds it introduced many opportunities to play stages non-linearly, even though the stages were still numbered. Every world had stages that were off the critical path, meaning you could play them out of order or even skip them if you liked. I'm not aware of any board game that works exactly like Super Mario Bros. 3, but each individual world map works more like, say, Trivial Pursuit than Monopoly. You choose what direction to go in, subject to certain restraints, and while there are challenges you eventually have to complete, it's your decision how you get to them. Even though I've never seen a board game that works like Super Mario Bros. 3, the fact is that you could make a board game that does. Print out the maps to all 8 worlds, whip up a counter that looks like Mario, and another 3 or 4 for the patrolling Hammer Brothers, and replace the stages with, trivia questions, and what you have is a working board game that would at least have the same map structure as Super Mario Bros. 3. What I'm getting at here is that you could not do the same thing with Super Mario World, because the design of this game requires the flexibility of a virtual experience. Its map is both full of secrets and constantly changing, and the way you reach alternate paths is by doing different things inside the stages. How you complete the stage changes which one comes up next, and this is the first time that concept had been seen in a Nintendo game. Though certainly not the last, as you know if you've played Star Fox 64 or Yoshi's Story. There were technically secret areas in Super Mario Bros. 3, but they were hidden by obstacles that you could deal with on the map itself, like boulders that could be smashed with the hammer to open up an off-screen treasure trove. The concept of a secret stage, or a secret path connecting Stage 3 in one world with Stage 6 in another, is totally alien to all of the 8-bit Mario games. But in Super Mario World, this is half the fun of playing. Here the lines between different worlds are blurred and folded into each other, until you end up with a map that barely feels like it is split up into different worlds. In this game, not only can you play the second stage of World 2 after the third stage of World 2, you can play the second stage of World 2 after arriving at the front door of Bowser's castle. Only about half a dozen stages are strictly mandatory if you know what you're doing. Choice in this game is less, do I want to play this stage or that one? And more, do I want to play the stages in this part of the map or just take a shortcut past them? Super Mario World preserves the distinction between ground stages, athletic stages, and so on to a certain extent, and adds a few new stage types of its own, like the eerie and confusing ghost houses found in most areas. But even here, you can see the effects of boundary blurring. Auto-scrolling, for example, can happen in almost any kind of stage, while previously it was confined to athletic stages and airships. Sometimes it even shows up for just a single room in a castle, while the other rooms let you move normally. Rather than being broken up stage by stage, gameplay gimmicks are more mixed together here, resulting in an experience that sometimes feels chaotic. Which brings up another point that separates Super Mario Bros. 3 from Super Mario World: the difficulty. In an interview with the Super Mario World team around the time it released in Japan, Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka were asked why their new game seemed so much easier than Super Mario Bros. 3. Characteristically, the two designers gave subtly different answers to that question. Tezuka noted that he wasn't a hardcore gamer, and tried not to let challenge get in the way of fun, while Miyamoto suggested that the game was meant to be welcoming to newcomers, but not necessarily unchallenging for experienced Mario players. The opinion that Super Mario Bros. 3 is harder than Super Mario World is pretty common, but having played through both games recently, I didn't notice any major decline in difficulty from one to the other. If anything, Super Mario World's tendency to throw lots of hazards at you from out of nowhere, combined with its generally longer stages, often made it the more frustrating of the two. But then again, I wasn't playing through the original version of Super Mario Bros. 3. What I played was the Game Boy Advance port from the mid-2000s, and there's a crucial distinction between that version and the one on the NES: the ability to save your progress. For all the innovations that Super Mario Bros. 3 included when it came out in 1988, you still had to beat it the same way as the original Super Mario Bros., in one session with a limited number of extra lives and continues. This may not seem like a big deal, but the fact that Nintendo held on to it when they had the technology to allow saving shows that they, at least, considered it essential to the feel of Mario. But Super Mario Bros. 3 wasn't as suited to this strict approach as the earlier Mario games were. It's a long game. Even an experienced player usually takes more than an hour to get all the way through it, and to play every stage would take around 2 hours, assuming, of course, that you don't die more than a handful of times and have to restart a world from the beginning. For players who valued their time, warping to later worlds was really a necessity. It meant that if you'd already gone through Waterland 5 times, you didn't have to redo all those stages again just to get another shot at Big Island. And Nintendo knew this. That's why several of Princess Toadstool's letters point you toward finding warp whistles in the first 2 worlds. Super Mario World, by contrast, gave you an opportunity to save your progress after every castle and ghost house, and its stages were put together with the fact that you could save in mind. That's one reason they're so long. Warping still exists in Super Mario World in the form of Star Road, but its purpose is no longer really to save time. The Warp Zone is now a proper world with its own unique stages, and while you can use it to skip practically the whole game, finding every secret exit here doesn't actually take you to the end of the game, but rather to a whole secret world containing stages more difficult than Bowser's Castle. I guess this is all a long-winded way of saying that apart from the handicap of being unable to save, Super Mario World isn't really an easier game overall than Super Mario Bros. 3. It just feels easier because it doesn't punish you as harshly for failure. Even the way the game reacts to a death reflects this. In Super Mario Bros. 3, when Mario loses a life, he's propelled spinning back to the last stage he completed, like the level is physically throwing him out. In Super Mario World, the screen just fades to black and fades back in on the map, and Mario doesn't move at all. Super Mario Bros. 3 let you assemble a stockpile of power-ups that could be used before any stage to make it easier, including some that trivialized the challenge. But it was the scarcity of these power-ups that kept you from overusing them. In Super Mario World, since you can replay easy stages, helpful power-ups are theoretically limitless, but they also aren't as helpful. All the really cheap ones, like the P-Wing or the Hammer Suit, are gone now, so the biggest advantage you can start any level with is a fully powered-up Mario with Yoshi. Even with the ability to carry a single reserve power-up into a stage, that still means you can only be hit 4 times before you're dead, and in some of the crazier levels in this game, that could happen in the span of a few seconds. I'm with Shigeru Miyamoto on this one. The challenge in Super Mario World isn't less than in previous games. It's just different, and doesn't increase predictably from one world to the next. Sometimes the difficulty curve drops way down for a single stage, only to catch you off guard with a sudden spike in the next. The Special World in particular is able to pull tricks that Takashi Tezuka would never have permitted before, precisely because you can beat the whole game without even seeing them, let alone completing them. So when you play this game, don't expect every stage in the later worlds to knock your socks off with challenge. What you should expect is the unexpected. Super Mario World doesn't really have a more detailed story than Super Mario Bros. 3, but it does draw the player's attention to it more and spend more time discussing it. In fact, similar to Super Mario Bros. 2, Rather than being thrown right into the action, the first thing you see when the game starts is a dialogue box informing you about the game's setting, Dinosaur Land, and that Princess Toadstool has been kidnapped again, and it looks like Bowser is at it again. Ha ha, that's my Bowser! I mean, the game isn't sarcastic about it, per se, but you can tell the exposition in these games is already getting a bit self-aware at this point. Upon entering the first stage, Yoshi's house, you'll find not any enemies or platforms, but rather more dialogue explaining that Yoshi has gone out to look for his captured friends. One interesting thing about this stage, by the way, is that because there's no enemies here, it gives you a chance to test out the game's movement mechanics in a challenge-free environment. Including a tutorial space like this later became a standard for the 3D Mario games, most famously with the area outside the castle in Super Mario 64. But the same idea is behind Delfino Plaza in Sunshine, and the bunny-chasing planetoid in Galaxy. Anyway, as with the last 3 games, for a more coherent version of the story, we have to turn to the manual. Apparently, Super Mario World is a direct sequel to Super Mario Bros. 3, with Mario, Luigi, and Princess Peach worn out from dealing with Bowser's invasion of Mushroom Land. To pick themselves up, they decide to take a vacation in a place called Dinosaur Land, because this was the late 80s, and everybody friggin' loved dinosaurs. Unfortunately, almost as soon as they get there, the princess gets kidnapped while Mario and Luigi are taking a nap on the beach. When they head into the forest to look for her, they instead run across an enormous egg, which turns out to have a little green dinosaur in it named Yoshi. He tells them that all of his friends were captured and put in eggs by a gang of monstrous turtles. Putting 2 and 2 together, the bros realize that Bowser has somehow managed to take over Dinosaur Land. And so off they go to do pretty much what they were doing before that this was supposed to be a vacation from. The strangest thing about the story in the manual is that the last paragraph of it isn't technically story. The part about Mario and Yoshi segues right into an explanation of how Super Mario World works, with the manual urging players to explore everywhere and try everything, really underscoring the idea that this game isn't as much about making it to the finish as it is about finding secrets. When you look at this game's overall presentation, there's no escaping the fact that it was aimed at a younger and less game-savvy audience than previous games in the series. Unlike Super Mario Bros. 3, which more or less expected you to figure things out just by playing, Super Mario World is full of these floating blocks, whose only purpose is to explain how things work. And sure, to be fair, this is a more complicated world than the ones from previous games, but a lot of the exposition is dedicated to things that haven't really changed. Nintendo expected, and hoped, that the Super Famicom would bring in an audience that was new to video games generally, so Super Mario World doesn't take anything for granted. The tutorials are always optional, but they were careful not to leave anything unexplained. The other thing about Super Mario World's narration is that it crops back up every time you rescue one of Yoshi's friends from one of the Koopaling's castles. Like so much else in Super Mario World, there isn't always more text here than there was in Princess Toadstool's letters last game, but it's different. The princess's letters were in first person, speaking directly to Mario, and much of the time they were gameplay focused. But in Super Mario World, the person speaking is a third-person narrator, and what he has to say is never gameplay related. He's just noting the end of one chapter of the story and the beginning of a new one. Nintendo didn't have to do this, and you could argue that it's a little bit out of place. These games never required a narrator before to give a "last time on Dragon Ball Z" speech telling you what you just did and where you're going next. But I would argue that Super Mario World's nonlinearity and the lack of sharp boundaries between worlds is what makes these scenes somewhat necessary from a dramatic perspective, because they're milestones that let you know you're making progress toward the game's ultimate goal. It would still work without them, but it might feel unsatisfying to wander around this giant world without knowing if anything you're doing is important. This is basically the game telling you, castles are a big deal, because that's where Yoshi's friends are, and they're run by Bowser's underlings, so take them seriously. Now, none of this is particularly sophisticated storytelling, and in fact, Super Mario World's biggest coup from a story perspective isn't how the story is told, but who it involves, your green dinosaur pal Yoshi. Yoshi was the first major Mario character to join the franchise since Princess Toadstool and Bowser were introduced in the original Super Mario Bros., and probably the most successful secondary protagonist in any Nintendo series to date. He was a brilliantly designed character with a lot of growth potential, which Miyamoto and his team did a fine job of exploiting to the fullest over the next decade. And I do think it's fair to put Miyamoto first in this discussion, because he pulled more for Yoshi to be included in this game than anyone else. I mentioned in the last video that Takashi Tezuka had wanted to see Mario fly for years before Super Mario Bros. 3 made it a reality, but Miyamoto has him beat when it comes to tenacity, because he had wanted Mario to have a noble steed since before the release of Super Mario Bros. Unfortunately, the idea just didn't work with 8-bit hardware. He never mentioned exactly why this was, but I suspect it's because the game would have to keep track of Mario and his mount separately, and there wasn't enough memory to have two playable characters on screen at the same time. But Miyamoto was never one to let hardware limitations stand in the way of his dreams, so he drew a sketch of Mario riding what looked like a giant chicken and taped it up near his desk while the team was making Super Mario Bros. 3. And until they found a way to do it for real, he made sure that everybody knew about that sketch. Come hell or high water, someday Mario was going to ride a horse. Or a chicken. Or, as it actually turned out, a green dinosaur with a big smile and a shell on his back. And yes, it turns out that thing is not a saddle, it's a shell. Long story, you can look it up if you're interested. Yoshi is actually a reasonably common Japanese first name, meaning something like good or dutiful. But it's more familiar as an expression of positive feelings, similar to okay or yeah in the US. And that's pretty much the key to Yoshi's personality. He's always happy and eager, even when all his friends have been kidnapped and he's trapped in a giant egg. This sounds kind of strange to say, but Mario is kind of a complex character with some rough edges, especially his working-class plumber background. While Yoshi is so sweet and lovable, he could have emerged fully grown from the forehead of Hello Kitty. And this duality, Mario and Yoshi, could stand in for the whole approach of Super Mario World. It's 2 games in one, a charming and approachable experience that's welcoming to first-time gamers and kids, while also holding on to that serious challenge under the surface, letting it bubble up a little at a time to cut through all that superficial syrupiness. At first glance, you might think that Super Mario World was all syrup. Even the toughest levels in this game have an art style that can only be described as cute. Bright, vibrant colors, enemies that move in an awkward and silly way, and hardly a sharp edge in sight. Part of this change can be attributed to the SNES's ability to draw larger sprites, but it also has something to do with the new talent that joined Nintendo in the late 1980s. All of Super Mario World's sprites, including Yoshi, were drawn by a practically brand new artist named Shigefumi Hino, whom Nintendo had hired in 1989. The art for the original Super Mario Bros. Was done by Miyamoto and Tezuka, who then passed down some of their work on to lower downs Tadashi Sugiyama, Yoichi Kotabe, and Hiroyuki Kimura. But for this game, Hino was the only credited artist, and he did a bang-up job when you consider that the previous game had a team of 4, including the most famous artist who ever worked at Nintendo. By the way, Shigefumi Hino would go on to be a pretty big deal himself. He came up with the idea for Yoshi's Island and co-directed it, then went on to co-direct the first 3 Pikmin games and do design work on Super Mario Wonder. He may also have been involved with putting all those Mario references in The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, since he was one of the 3 lead artists on that project. As for the other main aspect of presentation, the music, Super Mario World had the good fortune to come out on a system that had arguably the best sound quality of any home console, until the advent of Red Book audio with CD-driven systems like the Sony PlayStation. And series composer Koji Kondo used this new sound quality in a unique and, dare I say, very Koji Kondo-ish way. While he jumped at the chance to use samples that sounded more like real instruments than the earlier bleeps and bloops that Mario was known for, his approach to the soundtrack was largely defined by doing variations on a single basic melody. To be precise, this one. Some reviewers have pointed out that this tune sounds a lot like the American kinda folk, kinda pop song Green Green from the 1960s, but Kondo has never admitted a direct influence. And anyway, other parts of the various songs based on it sound like The Witch Doctor and the end of the Maple Leaf Rag, so who can say, really? It would be easy for a soundtrack composed in this way to feel stale and unoriginal, but although this motif is recognizable in either a major or minor key in most of the stage themes, differences in orchestration and tempo give each variation a unique identity to reflect the feel of the stage it appears in. Think of it as the 16-bit equivalent of Beethoven's Diabelli variations, or Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a Theme by Paganini. Or just think of it as a bunch of really good songs that happen to share a musical foundation. Theme with variations is a legit musical genre, and this soundtrack is a shining example of it. Plus, this isn't the only music in the game. There's also the individual area themes, like the bouncy bass-driven number for Yoshi's Island, and the chromatic string fantasia heard in the Forest of Illusion. We also have the theme for the final boss fight with Bowser, featuring overdriven guitar and a truly menacing bass line, essentially the first hard rock song in a Mario game. And don't forget the credits theme. I praised the credits in Super Mario Bros. 2, but I tell you frankly, they are nothing compared to the Super Mario World credits. This isn't just the best ending theme in a 2D Mario game, but probably my favorite ending theme to any game, although Luigi's Mansion and some of the Kirby games are up there too. I wouldn't necessarily say that all this aesthetic stuff is better than Super Mario Bros. 3, but it's certainly livelier, more colorful, and more polished. With this entry, the in-game graphics finally caught up to the cartoonish style seen in Nintendo's promotional art and manuals. Before, the manual was an essential part of the experience that filled in the gaps left by a plainer on-screen presentation. But here, the game itself presents both enough story and enough visual detail to activate your imagination on its own. If visuals and sound were the only criteria that people paid attention to in Mario, there wouldn't have been any question that Super Mario World was an improvement on Super Mario Bros. 3. But of course, they aren't. This is a video game, after all. No amount of whiz-bang spectacle can really distract people from the most important thing: how fun it is to play. One of the biggest design challenges facing the team when they started work on Super Mario World was that there wasn't much wrong with how the movement and challenge felt in the previous game. If you like platformers at all, Super Mario Bros. 3 was just about perfect. People are still raving about how good Mario feels to control in it. If you consider the goal of a sequel to be addressing the shortcomings or limitations of the original, that left the creators of Super Mario World at a loose end. So it should come as no surprise that they didn't change a whole lot. Basic gameplay mechanics are the least innovative aspect of Super Mario World, with no new power-ups except for the cape. And let's be honest, the cape is a lot like the Super Leaf, just a little harder to use and less spammable against the level design, although it still makes mincemeat of several otherwise difficult stages. One change that at least makes using the cape feel different is that you no longer have a power meter. Instead, when Mario is able to take off, he starts holding both his arms straight out, like a little kid pretending to be an airplane. It's cute, and more importantly, it takes some of the clutter out of the overlay, making it easier to get immersed in the game. Mario does get one major upgrade to his jump arsenal, the spin jump, which lets him break blocks below him, defeats weaker enemies in a single hit, and best of all, allows him to skip nimbly over the top of hazards, like thwomps, saw blades, and floating fuzzies. It's a little difficult to pull off, but the rewards are worth it. A lot of the coolest things you can do in this game involve using the spin jump. There's also the P-balloon, which temporarily inflates Mario and lets him fly through the air. I guess most people would call this a power-up, but I don't, because it's more of a liability in most stages than an advantage. While Mario is puffed up, you have no attack options, and his slow meandering in midair makes it easy for you to bump into an enemy or a projectile. Other than helping you unlock a few secret exits, this item doesn't show up much, and its most well-known inclusion in a stage would be better described as infamous rather than famous. Ooh, Tubular, someday you'll get yours, make no mistake. Oh, and before I forget, let me finally explain what P-switches do. These first appeared in Super Mario Bros. 3, where they have most of the same functions as the ones in Super Mario World. Pressing one will briefly cause all the floating coins in a stage to turn into solid blocks, while the existing blocks turn into coins. Sometimes this is used just to give you some more coins to grab, but at other times it creates platforms that help you reach secrets, or give you more space to maneuver, as long as you hurry up and don't get caught standing on coins when the timer runs out. But the P-switch had another function as well, which was seen in, I believe, only one stage. You remember it. It's the one I talked about in the side note, the fortress in World 7, where you have to fly up into the ceiling to find a hidden pipe. Pressing the P-switch in this level will open a mysterious door that you can go through to find a Tanuki suit. But it's worth noting that if you start this stage as Raccoon Mario, you don't technically have to use the P-switch. It's possible that some players went all the way through Super Mario Bros. 3, not realizing that P-switches can reveal hidden doors. Well, that's not a possibility in this game, because of the new mind-boggler of a stage type known as ghost houses. In these boo-infested, cobwebbed old mansions, the way forward is never, well, straightforward. You often have to double back in some way, sometimes using P-switches to reveal secret exits. On at least one occasion, you have to find a P-switch, stomp on it, exit and re-enter the room while it's still active, and smash the same block that held the P-switch, only now it sends up a vine that leads out of the stage. This is one of the easier ghost houses, incidentally. So that just leaves us with the biggest new gameplay addition, Yoshi. He has a grab bag of abilities, including a sticky tongue he can use to swallow enemies and spit parts of them back out, sturdy boots that protect his feet from hazards like munchers, the power to spit fire, fly, or slam into the ground when he eats special Koopa shells, and of course, immortality, of a kind. When you get hit while riding Yoshi, instead of disappearing right away, he'll just get spooked and run off. If you can catch up and remount him before he runs off a cliff or despawns, it's like nothing ever happened and he leaps right back into the fray. Yet, despite his many talents, and the fact that he's essential to finding many secret exits, I hesitate to call Yoshi a core game mechanic, because you can absolutely beat the game without using him. Also, he doesn't appear in every ground or athletic stage, and in fortresses, ghost houses, and castles, you can't even bring him in. Presumably he gets scared or something, like a horse would, but realistically, I think they just had a hard time designing set pieces that would accommodate him. A lot of the castles involve climbing, for instance, which Yoshi is unable to do. It was probably more trouble than it was worth to design around his limitations, but that's sort of my point. Since large chunks of the game were designed without considering him, he doesn't quite count as a basic gameplay mechanic, but at the same time he's definitely much more than a simple stage gimmick. It's a tough call. There's actually a lot more gameplay stuff in Super Mario World, but a surprising amount of it is unique to this game and never appeared again. So instead of dwelling on it at length, I'm going to cut to the part that's most relevant to Mario history, the new enemies. Super Mario World brings back a vast number of enemies from previous games, including a few like Ninjas and Pokies who were previously only in Super Mario Bros. 2. Sometimes they're given minor variations, like the Goombas, which now more closely resemble the chestnuts they were originally named after, and which don't disappear after being stomped on anymore. Koopas are a different kettle of fish. The team worked hard to differentiate this game's Koopas from earlier ones, and the differences are obvious right away. For one thing, they now walk upright, making them feel a lot more human, an impression reinforced by the fact that now when you hit them, they get bodily ejected from their shell, revealing that they wear little tank tops underneath. Shellless Koopas may look pretty pathetic, but they're not harmless. Some of them put on capes of their own and rush you in ground levels. Others leap into empty yellow shells and become indestructible rainbow-colored death machines. And if you ever forget that they can catch a shell you throw at them and punt it right back, trust me, you'll be sorry. Boos also aren't new in Super Mario World, but since variations on them are pretty much the only enemies you see in ghost houses, they're a lot more prominent here. The Boo Buddies, as they're now called, can really trip you up, especially the huge crowds of Boos who turn solid one at a time to swoop down and harass you. This game also gave us our first glimpse of Big Boo, one of the few enemies that's treated as a boss in almost every game where it appears. Super Mario World isn't lacking in entirely new enemies, though. Take Fuzzies, for instance. These annoying little fuzzballs started out as a very specific challenge in athletic stages, where they circled various platforms trying to chomp you. Later games did more with them, though, especially the Mario RPGs, which gave them a range of colors and powers, mostly related to parasitizing you in some way. Also making their debut here are Wigglers, a species of jolly yellow caterpillar who take a dim view of people jumping on their heads. If you attack a Wiggler normally, it turns bright red and slaps a nasty scowl on its face, getting faster and more aggressive in the process. Slurping these guys up with Yoshi or throwing a shell at them will take care of the problem, but without either of those things, you'd be better off running as far away as possible. You can't reason with an angry Wiggler. This was also an enemy that the creators of Mario spin-offs seemed to absolutely adore, especially Alpha Dream, the makers of Mario and Luigi, who found space for a Wiggler of some kind in every game they made until they went out of business. Possibly because of that, Wiggler is a lot more important to the franchise now than he was a few years after Super Mario World came out. He doesn't even show up in Yoshi's Island, and Super Mario 64 has just one tucked away in Tall Tall Mountain. Monty Moles are another new addition, though as I mentioned last time, they owe something to the design of the rocky wrenches from Super Mario Bros. 3. Monty Moles hide underground or inside hills and ground stages, then pop out and chase after Mario, apparently trying to swarm all over him like a gang of homicidal lemmings. Like so much else in this game, these guys are as cute as they are deadly. Don't let your guard down around them. Next up, we have a trio of enemies that only appear in underground stages: Swoopers, Spike Tops, and Blargs. Swoopers are green bats, although as a kid I could have sworn they were parrots or something, who, as the name suggests, swoop down from the ceiling to attack. They would be easy to defeat if they didn't have an oddly slow and arrhythmic movement pattern that can trip you up. That plus the fact that they start moving from off-screen. Spike tops are essentially red buzzy beetles with spikes on their heads. Not terribly unique, but I think it's worth noting that this is the first moving enemy in Mario history that can't be defeated by jumping, fireballs, or hitting them with the cape. There are ways to knock them out, but you usually don't have access to them in the stages where spike tops appear. This is just one of many ways in which Super Mario World discourages you from dealing with every enemy by attacking it. Instead, you have to rely on positioning and good timing to avoid enemies who can't simply be squished. Blargs are demented-looking dragonish things that lurk below the lava in some stages, emerging with a roar to try to knock you off those skull platforms you ride on. Blargs are very situational, memorable as they are while you're dealing with them, and it's a debatable point whether they're actually a recurring enemy. The ones that show up in Yoshi's Island look completely different and have different names, so you could claim that this is the only appearance of the original honest-to-goodness Blarg. And let's end this parade with two varieties of Koopa who sort of take the place of Hammer Brothers, who don't show up in this outing, although there is their radical cousin, the Amazing Flyin' Hammer Brother, or AFH Bro, who I have to imagine was originally set to appear in every future Mario game, including spin-offs, until he tragically died while on the way back to his home planet. It was no big loss, though, because in his place we have one of the most iconic Koopa-related enemies ever, Chargin' Chuck, who's also a surprisingly common sight in Dinosaur Land when you consider how difficult he is. I think he actually shows up in more levels than Yoshi. Anyway, Chargin' Chuck is a burly Koopa who wears a football helmet, cleats, and a chest protector. As soon as he spots Mario, he rushes forward to tackle him before he can get to the end zone. And before you say I'm just kidding around, he often does appear right at the end of stages, so that football metaphor isn't totally random. There are also other Chuck variants that leap into the air, split into multiple Chucks, presumably they were in a huddle, or kick footballs and dig up boulders to cause troubles from off-screen. This was always one of my favorite Super Mario World enemies, and I think Nintendo agrees with me, because after a long hiatus, he came back with a vengeance during the 2010s. He was a major presence in Super Mario 3D World, and reappeared in Super Mario Odyssey, and while he failed to make the cut for Super Mario Wonder, I highly doubt that the Mario team is done with him just yet. Our last enemy, by contrast, is not one of my favorites. In fact, to be brutally honest, I hate these guys. Magic Koopas show up in only 2 stages, both of which are castles, and in both cases they're the most annoying part of the stage. Stage nothing, they're the most annoying part of the whole game. Magic Koopas warp in and out of visibility, sort of like Wizzrobes from The Legend of Zelda. Unlike Wizzrobes, they don't just shoot a beam at you and go away. Magic Koopas fire a spell that looks like animated controller symbols, which both does damage and turns blocks into enemies. This may not seem so frustrating at first, but the second time you see them there are 2, not 1, 2 barriers made entirely of blocks that you have to let them hit with their spells to get through. Half the time, though, they show up right next to you and just snipe you with magic, barely giving you a chance to jump out of the way. It's also difficult to kite them into hitting the block you want, and watching the spell fly uselessly through the tiny hole that was created 30 seconds ago, which you can't fit through unless you get hit, not a good idea by the way, it's just maddening. These guys are obnoxious, and I'm glad they never showed up in quite the same form again. Yoshi's Island only had one Magic Koopa, Kamek, and he only pulls the magic spell thing in a single hallway in the last stage. Let's also not forget that in that game, getting hit twice isn't the end of the world, because of changes to the health system. After that, they didn't return until Super Mario Galaxy. And let's be honest, when you can move in 3 dimensions, these guys aren't anywhere near as difficult as they were originally. Speaking of obnoxious, let's talk mini-bosses. I've already mentioned Big Boo, but another recurring mini-boss is Reznor, the group of 4 Triceratops, is that what they are? That shows up at the end of fortresses. To beat them, you have to jump underneath each one of the platforms on the little carousel with their name haphazardly bolted to it, while the platform of logs you're standing on slowly falls into the lava. Eventually, you have to get on the carousel itself, while dodging the fireballs that they regularly cough up at you, and if you can knock all of them off, you win. I have never liked Reznor, mostly because there isn't a lot of flexibility in how you approach fights with them. If you don't knock off at least one before the log platform disappears, you lose. If you're bad at maneuvering on the tiny carousel platforms, you lose. You basically beat these guys by getting really good at following a specific jumping pattern, and that's not much fun in my book. Either that or use fireballs, but as we established last video, I am almost never Fire Mario. I like flying, okay? Go ahead and sue me, it doesn't make this mini-boss any better. What I am a fan of is the 7 Koopaling fights, which do have a lot of variety and do let you approach the encounter in different ways depending on your powers. Also, I have to admit that part of the appeal for me is that most of these fights are pretty easy. You can beat Roy Koopa in like 10 seconds if you know what you're doing. I don't think any of them is harder than the Reznor encounter, which is just bizarre. I criticized Boom Boom in the last video for being too easy compared to the Koopalings, but this is going way too far in the other direction. In any case, once you've defeated the last Koopaling, Larry, you end up right in front of Bowser's castle. This is clever design, since it allows you to save right before the final stage, and you need that because it's a doozy. In a design that would be imitated 5 years later by Yoshi's Island, this stage gives you your pick of 4 rooms, each of which challenges different skills, then another round of 4 rooms that are slightly harder, and finally a voyage through the darkened rear hallways of the castle, ending up with a climb to the castle battlements for the showdown with Bowser. What can I say about this final boss that hasn't already been said before? It's an epic multi-stage encounter in which you run along the battlements while Bowser hovers above you in his soon-to-be-iconic Koopa clown car, hurling Mecha Koopas and steel balls at your head, until he finally loses it and just starts dive-bombing you over and over again. Just like the rest of the game, this feels easier than previous final bosses in Mario, but it's still a tense, controller-gripping fight that you have to learn thoroughly before you can consistently beat it. The fight with Bowser in Super Mario Bros. 3 felt cheap and too difficult. This one eases up, and to me it feels just right, challenging but not frustrating for an experienced player. It's the cherry on top of a very sweet and rewarding experience, and one I heartily recommend to anyone between the ages of 5 and 500. In retrospect, the fact that Super Mario World was such a great game feels a little bittersweet, because in a way it was the last of its kind. 5 years would go by before the release of its sequel, and while I love Yoshi's Island and consider it one of the best games ever made, it's also very different in terms of core mechanics and level design. Playing as Yoshi just doesn't evoke the same nostalgic feeling that playing as Mario does. You could get a bit of that feeling from playing Super Mario Land 2, I guess, which was closer to the classic Mario style than its predecessor was, but an experience designed for the Game Boy was never going to compete in terms of spectacle and scale with a series that originally made its mark on home consoles. The power gap between the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy was enormous, and clever design could only do so much to bridge it. If you were waiting around for a proper 2D sequel to Super Mario World, you were in for a long wait. I don't think the new Super Mario Bros. Series really counts, because none of those games took a huge leap of innovation the way Mario's first 4 outings did. I'm not saying these are bad games, but they were pretty derivative, probably intentionally so. My personal opinion is that 2D Mario was stuck in a rut of endlessly rehashing Super Mario Bros. 3 until the release of Super Mario Wonder a few years ago, which really felt like it was taking Mario somewhere he'd never been before. So when we talk about the legacy of Super Mario World, part of that legacy is its status as a milestone that marks the end of classic Mario, and his subsequent voyage into strange new lands of spin-offery. However, that is only one thing, and this game had a lot more to offer than that. For instance, Yoshi is in this game. And Yoshi is a big, big deal. He was the Baby Yoda of his day, a merchandising bonanza that also gave Nintendo countless ideas for future stories. There's an alternate universe somewhere in which after Yoshi's Island came out, Nintendo just kept making Yoshi games for 30 years, and Mario became a side character in his own franchise. Another story innovation is the establishment of continuity from one game to the next. Super Mario World was the first Mario game to acknowledge the events of a previous game in its story. Mario, Luigi, and the princess are taking a vacation because of what happened in Super Mario Bros. 3. There are references to it in the gameplay too, like the sunken ship that guards the entrance to Bowser's Valley, which looks like what would happen if an airship from the previous game crashed into the sea. You even finish the stage by picking up one of those magical orbs that used to appear after you defeated Boom Boom in a fortress. That's about it for story stuff. Unless you count Bowser riding in the Koopa clown car. That stuck around, it's just not exactly rich with implications for Bowser's personality. But really, this is Mario. What else would you expect? You want story? Go play Zelda. One of the clearest ways in which Super Mario World marks the end of the classic Mario era is the basic enemy types it added to the series' playbook. This is the last Mario game to introduce more than a handful of enemy types that would become standard in future entries. If it didn't show up by this point, it probably doesn't appear in more than 2 or 3 games in the whole series up to the present day, not counting spin-offs, of course. Super Mario World's new enemies aren't as prominent in the iconography of the series as boos or thwomps, but a few of them managed to book an appearance in several future games. I'd say the most essential additions were Fuzzies, Wigglers, Swoopers, Spike Tops, Magic Koopas, and especially Monty Moles, who appear in a staggering number of Mario games and spin-offs for an enemy that was never a playable character until Mario Kart Tour in 2020. He just seemed to pop up all over the place, which is quite fitting now that I think of it. Mario's new spin jump returned as a core mechanic in Super Mario Land 2, but after that it never reappeared in exactly the same form. The spin jumps in 3D Mario are quite different, particularly because they don't let you jump on otherwise hazardous surfaces, which is most of what you get out of doing it in this game. There's also all the new stuff associated with Yoshi, the way Mario rides on his back, his ability to swallow enemies, the idea that he eats fruit to make special things happen, the association with eggs. Although originally it was Yoshi who got stuck in an egg by Bowser, the idea of Yoshi turning enemies into eggs would have to wait until Yoshi's Island. And as far as core mechanics are concerned, that's about it. Oh, I guess Mario's cape got brought back in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Does that count? I guess that counts. More so than story or gameplay mechanics, map and stage design is the area in which Super Mario World really shines. The troubling thing is that many of its innovations weren't followed up on by the rest of the series. To this day, there's never been another map in a Mario game with the flexibility of Dinosaur Land, a place with so many secrets in it that it almost feels like finding secrets is more important than beating Bowser. Later games in the series, 2D ones anyway, have been more structured and focused, and while that was probably the right move, it's still a bit disappointing. One change that did become standard was the idea of a distinction between fortresses and castles, with fortresses holding mini-bosses and marking a kind of halfway point through an area, and castles holding bosses and marking the end of an area. Since both castles and fortresses appeared in Mario games before, you might not realize that Super Mario World did this first, but the earliest games with castles did not have fortresses, and Super Mario Bros. 3, which introduced fortresses, didn't have castles. It used airships instead. That's not counting Bowser's castle, which obviously exists. The point is that castles weren't a stock stage type that appeared in every world. Yoshi's Island followed this new guideline religiously, with every world having a fortress as Stage 4 and a castle as Stage 8. And the new Super Mario Bros. Series also made sure to include a fortress and a castle in every world. It's a debatable point whether Super Mario World was the first Mario game to have a bonus world in it. The Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 had a World 9 that was pretty wacky, and also featured a message of congratulations to the player. That was probably a forerunner of the Special World. But what this game unquestionably added is the aesthetic of the Special World, the idea that it's way up in space and glowing with rainbow colors, a palette that would go on to be used in final stages for several Mario spin-offs. Rainbow Road, anyone? And finally, one more aesthetic touch. The idea of having a characteristic musical motif that represents the game as a whole, not just a specific stage type. Super Mario 64 implemented this in the same way that Super Mario World did, and over the last decade or so, it's been more the rule than the exception for Mario soundtracks. If you remember playing a Mario game and a certain song immediately pops into your head, from the da-da-da-da-da-da-da of the first 2 new Super Mario Bros. Games to Jump Up Superstar from Super Mario Odyssey, this game is at the root of it. It would be hard to argue that Super Mario World is the most influential of the first 4 Mario games. The original Super Mario Bros. Probably still deserves that title, and if there's a challenger for it, Super Mario Bros. 3 is a better candidate than Super Mario World. There are as many innovations in this game that don't appear in a single other entry as there are lasting, permanent additions to the franchise's legacy. But just like the American Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario World is an essential part of the series because it didn't iterate on past entries in a safe, predictable way. In contrast to the first and third entries, these 2 games took Mario to some bizarre places to see just how far the character and his universe would stretch before it was too far. Super Mario World is the most experimental of the first 4 Mario games, and it proved that you can go a long way in the direction of strange and ridiculous before the experience falls apart. No other Mario game makes me laugh more than this one. No other Mario game makes me want to push the envelope and see what I can get away with more than this one. Honestly, no other Mario game makes me grit my teeth and say, "Oh, that was bullshit," more than this one. But I only get angry about it because I know this world has me totally hooked. I can't just put down the controller and wait a day or two before finishing this difficult level. I have to show it who's boss right now. That's immersion. That is the very essence of immersion, and it has nothing to do with realism or complex storytelling, because Super Mario World doesn't have much of a story, and it's completely unrealistic. It's immersive just because it's so much freaking fun. If anything proves Takashi Tezuka's motto that fun is more important than challenge, this does. Super Mario World is not as challenging as Super Mario Bros. 3. The controls aren't quite as smooth. The level design is noticeably less fair. But it's still the better game. In my humble opinion, of course.